I will be welcoming. I'll be having a discussion today and welcoming on stage Letty Hayes. She's a partner, data governance and data management transformation, insight, innovation. So you can come on stage and have a seat. And we're going to be talking about data as an asset to data as a product and how we can overcome the barrier to scales in the financial services. So thank you very much, and we're going to start the session right now. Welcome. How are you
Thank you.
doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so we have 30 minutes of chat, and so we're going to try to. I know there's a lot we can talk about, but we're going to try to just like condense everything. So first of all, the first question that comes to, well, my mind, and maybe the audience's mind as well, is data asset to data product. What is it? Is it a journey? But what is data asset versus a data product? Can you just explain to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So my area of expertise is in the financial services sector, primarily banks, regulators, insurance companies, credit unions. And I also come from a risk management background. So throughout my conversation, you'll probably see that coming through. Earlier in my career, I had a business background, and so every time that I work with data, I try to have a business perspective as well. So historically, what happened with the banks, they were subject to increasing regulation, and so they needed to put new rule and manage the data, and so this whole subject around data management and data governance came about. And so the banks came and said, wow, we need to do all this. What really is data to us? And so they labeled it as an asset. And so they created all these rules, the governance structures, all the standards, everything channeled through usually a chief data office. And it was all driven by regulatory requirements and regulation. And so when we're trying now to move to the next level of evolution, thinking of data as a product doesn't actually go in conflict with what we had before. Assets, if you think about them, they're supposed to create and bring us value and money anyway. So the next level of evolution for the organizations would be, how do we think of data not just as a passive asset, something there to label, inventory, control it, govern it, and do all this huge infrastructure that we've created around data management, and how can we take that to the next level and operationalize it in a new way and get some more value out of it. So really the concept of data as a product goes around getting more value out of something that you already have, collect, and check.
Right. Like any asset you have, and then what do you do with it?
Right. How do you use it
how do you use it?
Create value? And that value could be monetary, but could be intangible value as well.
Exactly. And then, so that transformation journey, what does it look like, the shift from just data sitting there as an asset to data as a product, that mindset? What changes in the operating model, say the roles, funding, governance, decision-making?
Well, that's exactly it. You nailed it. It is a mindset first and foremost.
Right.
It doesn't change a lot of practical or technical aspects. You still need your systems, you still need your data office. What it changes is the economics around it, and it changes a lot on the cultural side and that mindset. So usually it also goes around data ownership. Traditionally when you had all these systems, they needed to integrate that because usually data is very siloed within the systems that it's being captured in. And then the large financial institutions created the data lakes and the data warehouses to be able to source in a unique spot for all their data needs. A lot of the ownership kind of was system-based. It wasn't as integrated with the business needs always. And so when you're thinking of this next level of evolution, the ownership around data changes slightly. You're more focused on the data domains, but on the business itself. And the mindset goes beyond just a collection of information and mostly used for regulatory reporting, but it goes more into, now that you think about it as a product, so you have an associated cost with it, you're thinking about what are the consumers of that data in a more specific manner beyond just the regulatory reporting pieces, and then it goes into more of a product lifecycle mentality. What is it for? Who's your audience? How are you funding it? What is the value you create? How you improve it, and all that.
One thing you mentioned is this siloed data assets. And I'm wondering, is that one of the biggest challenges, or what's the biggest challenge in this transformation?
I think traditionally that was a bit of a challenge when they moved into the enhanced regulatory reporting and they needed a lot more information, and then they realized that a lot of their systems weren't necessarily talking to each other. Collecting the data and ensuring the data quality was a big challenge. The data quality still remains a challenge in this new model, but it's a different distinction. So for example, when you deal with regulatory reporting, your data quality obviously needs to be there. But depending on the kind of reporting that you do, sometimes you compensate for that, and sometimes you can add a monetary value to your imperfect data and say, this is really going to cost us this amount of millions of hundreds of millions, and you put that into your reports. When it comes to using it as a product, it needs to be a lot more laser focused because it would have a direct impact into the P&L or the P&L of that initiative in which you're using it as a product. And so the quality of the data becomes a lot more critical. And in general, you need to be in a much more integrated model where your owners, your consumers of data, and you have a much more active partnership with technology teams as well as the chief data offices.
Yes, and that's actually very interesting because we're going to touch on two of the things that you mentioned now is, first of all, a product can span different domains, right? And we want to talk about accountability and ownership. Siloed data assets, but then we need to bring everything together to come up with a data product. And so it's a simple and straightforward question. Who becomes the product owner of that data product?
So that's probably a new role that you need to create. You need to, when you're thinking of data as a product, you actually need to create this data ownership, data product owner. So you see in the data space, we have data stewards, we have data quality specialists, we have a whole slew of roles around data governance and around data. But because it's all around the rather passive approach of somebody collects the data and we just need to make sure that it's being used properly, that we know the quality of the data, that it goes around, aligned with our standards and so on. And then there's also another area of data privacy and all the very specific rules and regulations around data. This would be something additional, something that would bring that and would extract more value out of the data that you already have and collect. But it does go back to how you design your system sometimes and what kind of data you collect as well as how you collect it. And it is critical to be a lot more integrated. So I'll give you an example. There's these concepts around the client 360 view, and sometimes that happens from an organization perspective, whether you're a banker or an insurer, you look at your client and you try to get information from all sorts of angles. But sometimes it happens from a regulatory perspective as well. I worked with regulators that were trying to implement, because they were cross-functional regulators, so they were regulating a number of sectors. They were trying to integrate that into a 360 view. So in other words, when a company comes to visit them, they wanted to know not just what they do in one sector, but in all of the sectors in which they operate. So when you do that, you need to be much more integrated within your sectors, within your teams, and your partnership needs to be much more active between the business world and the IT world, for example. So a lot of the times, the business just goes to the IT as a service provider. They need a new functionality, they need to collect a new data. The IT goes, creates that for them, and sort of that's it. This is, I think at the end of the day, this is a model in which there is a more active and ongoing partnership between those business needs with the IT, because at the end of the day, they still support the infrastructure, the technical part, and then the chief data office when it comes to standards and the quality. Because we all know at the end of the day, the critical part in terms of using the data is the quality that it has. I mean, the better the quality, the more usage and the more exact usage out of it you can get. And a lot of that goes down to the input, the originating systems. You need to have the right input controls, because that it'll cut your costs and it'll create more operating efficiency. So I think it's actually very interesting, because a lot of the conversations that I've heard throughout the conference around AI and all the use cases, I think they're absolutely fabulous. But as a data quality and as a data management expert, I always go back to how do you ensure that the data you use for whatever models, whether they're AIs, whether they're traditional models, how do you ensure that the quality of the data that you put in, it's high enough,
Right.
let's say,
Right.
so that your results are on target?
But that would be would that be a different space? So is that who's in charge of the quality of the data? Is this as an asset, like you said, there's stewardship, and then you have your product. Once you have your product, is that two separate roles, or do you see them as one role that should take ownership of the data, the quality, and the product?
So from a product perspective, it's an evolved role where you're really more integrated with the business and you have a much more business-like view. From a quality perspective, as I said earlier, the quality of the data is important in both sort of approaches, but it's much more critical when you're using data as a product, because you rely a lot more, or you take for granted that the quality, that there is an intrinsic high-level quality of the data that you have.
Right, and the reason why I was asking this is because, you know, a lot of people, we all love to take credit for an awesome product that is working, but then when things go south, rarely anybody wants to take accountability. So how do we enforce accountability of your data product, especially if it's a product that span multiple domains? So it combines different data assets from different departments. How do you think we can enforce that accountability?
I think that's a great question. I think there is a great conversation around accountability in general. How do we enforce it and how do we define it, especially in an organization? Usually I work with very large financial institutions, so you have a lot of layers of leadership, of executives, senior leadership. And so that accountability is critical. At the end of the day, there's two facets to it. There is the accountability component, and then there is the partnership, the collaboration component. Accountability will only get you that far. At the end of the day, you need to engage with the different areas, and you have to have almost like an equal partnership in the different domains or areas that you span. And that's one of the challenges, is that it's increasingly difficult to understand where you belong as part of an end-to-end process, and sometimes it's even difficult to understand what are all the various teams or the areas that are involved, or they pick up information from there. And again, in a risk management space, because you had so much regulation, a lot of that was driven by regulation, and now it's sort of catching up to what is it more that I can do with the information that I have.
Right. So your final data product, somebody is accountable, have ownership on it, and if anything goes wrong, then we need to go back to the layers and all the different aspects that were used to do that data product. Is that correct?
You need four critical partners. You need the business, you need the IT because they provide the infrastructure, you need the chief data office because they still are responsible for all the standards, the metadata, the catalogs of the data, ensuring the quality is there and so on. And then you need the risk component because you want to make sure that you are still meeting compliance.
Right, and you know what? Now that you're mentioning those different roles into the data product, that reminds me of the concept of a federation versus a centralized approach. And my question here is how can then organizations, especially as they scale, balance a federated domain-driven approach with centralized risk control?
Yeah, in my experience, a lot of the banks or a lot of the large financial institutions still have more of a centralized approach, and a lot of it's driven through the data offices because it's driven, again, by compliance. You've had some guest speakers earlier today where they talked about how their organizations employ a more federated approach. When you're centralized or when you're heavily centralized, it's harder to nurture innovation because everything kind of has to go through one lens, one common view. When you are at the other end of the spectrum, to federate it, you increase your risk of operation. So the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle, or in other words, there is a way of doing a hybrid approach where you still have your execution federated, and so you can have sort of many teams through which some of that execution is being done so that it's close to the business, so that it's customized and takes into account all the various specificities. But you still need a centralized function where you do some of the chief data office requirements around metadata, data quality, data lineage, and all the other data management activities.
So a mix of both?
A little bit of those, yes.
Okay. Well, I mean...
So that you can take the good from
both sides.
And minimize the cons.
Right. So, I mean, we talked about data asset to data product and the importance of that shift in mindset to data product, along with, the ownership, accountability of those data products and how the journey looks like. And you did mention one of the things that at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned data product, why it's important. It's because it drives value. And I'd like to move on to that big topic that everybody's been talking about. We've been hearing about it for the past 2 days. ROI, return on investment. So there's this big phenomenon of, how can we measure return on investment? Is it worth the investment? And so, how do you think organization should approach the pricing and the extracting value from data products?
That's a great question. Before I'm going to answer that, I'm curious to ask a question to the audience.
Sure.
If you can do a show of hands, how many of your organizations are still funding most of their data initiatives through sort of one-time transformation, big projects, big investments, versus just part of their regular operational?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 6. The more
Right.
more heads.
So you see, I think this is very telling because that is still tied a lot to that data as an asset view, and it's still tied a lot to outside forces that are driving some of the initiatives internally. It's only once you sort of exit that space and have the luxury or have the mindset to change and think of the value that you can create with your data, that you're starting to think more around this ROI piece. And I think I'll disappoint you because my view is not going to be fundamentally different from the views of some of the other speakers you had here today. My experience has been absolutely the same. There are the three key areas where you need to look around the value that you create, around the costs that you're saving, the operational piece, and then the risks that you minimize or the risks that you eliminate. If for the risks, sometimes it's a much more clear line in terms of how you use your data or what you do your data with, what you've avoided, mostly because of how you define your risks and you define your specific mitigation strategies. Sometimes on the cost and especially the revenue side, things are a little bit more muddy. How do you know that increase in revenue, or how do you know what's the percentage from that increase in revenue that can be attributed to the data piece versus marketing versus something else? And on the cost side, there's a lot of that as well, because usually cost and efficiencies initiatives that you have in large organizations, they chip a little bit here and there and make you more efficient. But it's not always easy to say that overall, you're 50% more efficient because of your data, and the other 50% comes from, I don't know, some automation process, for example. So it's very difficult to draw back the line between your results and the specific change in data, because usually, especially in large organizations, there's so many changes that happen, and so they get compounded, and then they create an impact. And you could only guarantee that it's coming from your data if that would be the only thing you change, but they won't be the only thing you change.
Right. Yes, because everything else is not constant, so everything's changing. So how are we measuring that? Why do you think return on investment is particularly a challenge when it comes to data? Measuring the ROI? Is it because you just mentioned it? Is it because we're not sure whether it's coming from the data product itself or from marketing efforts or from is that why, or?
That's part of it.
I'm going kind of on a tangent here.
That's part of it. There's a couple of critical areas where there's challenges in moving this mindset from the asset to the more value-driven approach. Technology is not one of them because you have the technology there. It's usually around the mindset and it's around the funding model. That's why I was asking how many are still funding from transformation initiatives, sort of one-time big investments versus on an ongoing basis, because that tells you where you are on your maturity level or on that progression model. So funding is a big piece of it, and then it's all driven from the top as well. It's all driven by leadership too. So how much of, let's say, the business scorecard or the
how can that data help us move into
tied
that
from, at the leader's level, how much is that tied to your digital transformation and specific to data within an organization? That's another indicator of where you are on that continuum. Because the more you are, your executive's performance is tied to what happens from a digital transformation perspective, the more you are in that space of creating value versus just responding to requirements, whether regulators or others.
I totally agree. That's why everybody's undergoing this digital transformation, because it's just how things are speeding up, and using data. Again, if we go back to data asset versus data product, and that shift in mindset where, like my data is not just data sitting there. I want to transform it into a product. And maybe part of the digital journey also for many organizations. It does, and you mentioned this, it's very important that the culture and the people are aware of that, right? And one interesting thing is that we don't talk about it often, I feel, is what is the impact on people? So how can organizations provide the right incentives to work around cultural barriers or resistance or?
That's a good question, and I was starting to allude to that component a little earlier. A few years ago, data literacy was not even a thing.
Yeah.
It was, you were doing your job, and all of a sudden, these guys were knocking on your door, and they were saying, we're from the chief data office, and we're going to do this and that and the other, and we're going to create standards and metadata and data quality and data quality checks. And people were like, okay, but I have a job to do, and you're just going to take a lot of my time for this. That was a process. That was an evolutionary process where the data roles and the data standards and the governance around data quite honestly evolved first, and then it had to bring along everybody else. It had to bring a lot along the business so that they can start talking the same language. And all of a sudden, we were talking about data literacy and how much of that you have or not in an organization. And now we are at the point, it was actually funny, at lunchtime we were talking about mandatory courses and trainings and how sometimes you do the same thing over and over each year for regulatory compliance. But now a lot of those courses are actually around data, and they teach everybody in the organization basic concepts around data and how to think about that and how to approach that. And I think sometimes even that is not always sufficient. There was a time where, for example, a long time ago, risk management was a thing, and then it became so integrated into everything some of these financial organizations were doing that it was this new saying that everybody needs to be a risk manager. Well, I think to a certain degree, almost everybody needs to be a bit of a data manager these days, because you work with data every day, whether sometimes you realize it or not. And so all of that mindset and all of those requirements around data, you have to be watching for them all the time. And that goes back to the business. That goes back to the people that collect the information that need to understand a little bit better what is it used for. And in many cases, it's hard to say that because you kind of develop and discover new uses for that data as you go. So that's part of why some of these large organizations, some of these challenges are around how the communication flows up and down and back again. How do you integrate the different teams? How do you create those partnerships? How do you maintain them on a regular basis? And then the accountability. It's shared accountability, but shared accountability sometimes is viewed as we're sharing it, so it's really more your accountability than mine. That's not what shared accountability is. That really goes back to that equal partnership and really understanding how what you do impacts other use cases and other people as well. So I think it's very interesting in this era of AI, when we're developing a lot of these user cases. It's interesting because what my experience is in some of these large organizations, even these cases are very specific on very small niches, on very, very specific cases. And how are you going to then take that and scale? How are you going to then take that and use this in more areas? Because that's where you're going to actually have your transformation and your revolution within the organization.
Right, and exactly, and it all comes back again, like you said, to the business and what are the needs of the business. And as you said, maybe they're not really aware of that shift to data product. What's the value that's gonna come in out of it? And I have a question here in regards, and based on your experience, when a business requires a data product, do they actually know this is the product that we want, or do they go, we want to increase our bottom line or save cost or provide this new service to customers, and then the technical team will figure it out? And do you find that there's a gap between the communication between the technical and the business people, so the people who are working on creating the data product and the stakeholders? Have you ever encountered that?
I mean, obviously, it depends on the circumstances and the organizations. A lot of the time, when it comes from the business, they're very specific and they know very well what they need. Whether that conversation always translates into an easy, tangible solution when it comes to the technical side, sometimes it happens better than others. But again, as you are in some of these large organizations, I think the critical part is understanding whether there's other areas that may require something similar or the same type of information, because that will create additional
duplication.
Well, you don't. That's what you want to avoid. You
Right.
want to avoid the duplication. So you want to create synergies, and you want to build a solution that's more integrated. I think ultimately we will start seeing more and more integrated solutions. It's not an easy evolution because there were so many legacy systems, but more and more because you're trying to create that 360 view, or really trying to integrate information from the different instances. You will see new type of systems that address that. It's not always easy because of regulation. Again, sometimes you cannot share information, even if you have it. You may not be able to share it from one part of the company to another part of your own company, but there's ways around it as well. I mean, there's ways to build the systems and accommodate that. And still make more integrated use of the data that you have, yes.
Right, and contribute to creating value.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I'm just going to take a look at the time. Okay, I do have another question, but I just want to make sure if there's any questions from the audience, because usually when I moderate with speakers like Letty, we end up chatting a lot, and there's no time for Q&A. So, any questions? Yeah,
yes, please.
You guys mentioned ROI, and ROI has a different metrics. So fintech, financial, like banks, what is the metrics and measurements you guys are looking for when it comes to ROI? And everybody using LLMs today, they see actual value coming from using these tools, but I haven't heard any metrics or how we can measure those.
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends a little bit on the industry, and of course it depends on the circumstances. So, like I said earlier in my presentation, or in our conversation, some of the value that you create, sometimes you can monetize it, but not always. Sometimes it's intangible value, and sometimes it's just the cost that you're saving or some of the risks that... So, of course, the fintech world is different from a traditional bank that has a lot of regulatory requirements and a lot of compliance. It's also different from what you see in insurance or the credit union space. And it's also different from if you were a regulator and you are actually regulating some of these industries, and whether you're, for example, solvency regulator and you're very heavy on capital requirements and reporting, or whether you are a market conduct, a business conduct regulator, where you are a lot more on the soft side of things and how business is being conducted and what kind of metrics you can create there, which are not always the obvious ones. Go ahead.
You know, I was gonna mention metrics because when I'm thinking about it is, let's say in a bank you have the fraud department. Well, fraud, they're gonna do a data product, but the goal, the end goal with the success is not money at the end of the day. It's giving a better customer experience, preventing fraud, etc. So I think maybe when we talk about ROI is organizations maybe 10 years ago just started dumping a lot of money into AI. We wanted this product, this product, this product. But maybe we missed a step. And again, these are things that I have read, and I can give you the name of the book. It's a very interesting. And then maybe the first step is to decide on the KPI, because it doesn't always have to be monetary. Now, on a high level, I would say, like from a CEO perspective, is okay. How do we get more money? But again, it's different domain together that will create all these data products, either separately or together, and then evaluate it. I think the data product itself is not always revenue oriented. It's yeah, but indirectly it will generate revenue. Like if you're good at detecting fraud, everybody's going to come to you. Yeah.
Well, and to add
What do
to
you
that,
think? Yeah.
to add to that, sometimes when you're thinking of these products, you don't always have to think of them being marketable products, so not always outside to consumers. Sometimes it could be an internal consumer, and so the way you monetize internally or the way you do your transfer pricing, it's different from the way you would sell externally.
Right. Totally agree.
Any other questions?
Before we... other questions? Okay, so we can still chat a little bit. I had a question, more of a, like, if you can give us some concrete, because we talked about, data asset, it's been there forever, data product's important, there's a shift in the mindset, there's a lot of components, regulatory, data quality, a lot of components to it, and people involved in creating this data product, as well as ownership and accountability. And then we talked about the ROI as well, because, I mean, at the end of the day, we want to move to data products so that we can drive value. It doesn't necessarily have to be monetary directly, it can be indirectly. And then the culture and the people. Can you? And I'm just wondering, just have like a practical example of that you may have, seen or heard of or worked on of a successful data product. Like, or we can do it hypothetically, if you want. Like, what is the requirements for the data product to be successful? Like we mentioned data quality, we mentioned, several, is it only data quality? Is it the data product itself? Because we can build 100 data products, but are we using them all? That's also another question. So, does anything, if you have any example or something that sparked your mind about, okay, we're moving data asset to data product, but now, are we using them? Are they successful? Because I see a lot of data products that are just put away, and
yeah, I mean, like any traditional product, let's say, you need to be very clear about why you're building it and who's going to use it and for what purposes. So, for example, I was working with a regulator a while ago, and they were becoming responsible to regulate a new sector. And so they had to collect information from the marketplace, initially to do the licensing, then they had to do a review of the sector, and because it was the first time that this particular sector was being regulated and it was under their purview, they really knew very little about what was happening in the marketplace. And so they had to design the licensing in a way in which it was a first-time collection of information, and it was a little bit more comprehensive than maybe other sectors that they were already regulating for a number of years than they had information on. And so they had to create a whole new system for this particular sector. They started with the licensing, but then they realized that they want to use the same system and the same functionality to continue to collect information and continue to update their knowledge about who the regulated entities were. And so initially they were starting with licensing, then they were collecting, they had an annual information that they had to comply with and provide. And they were using all of this for the purpose of them understanding the sector better, but then they were packaging it and they were sharing it with other compliance areas within the regulator so that they can drive their annual plans for audit and reviews and also understand what kind of risks or what kind of themes were emerging in this particular sector. So that was an interesting example because they've transformed basically the licensing function, which was I need to get some information from you to make a decision whether I'm going to allow you to operate in this sector or not. And they've transformed that into actually making it a useful collection of information. They structured it in a way in which it wasn't just a one-time thing. They had to come back and be sort of in touch with the regulator, so the regulator actually is in touch as well with the marketplace. And then they were using all that, and they were not taking it and putting it on a shelf, but they were actually using it internally, and they were packaging it internally cross different other teams. And so that helped and enhanced their internal collaboration. And it was a good model then they were able to replicate in other sectors and in other of the industries that they were regulated, some of them more traditional. So moving from that space of, I think I know what's going on because I talked to somebody and somebody talked to somebody else, into I actually do know what's going on because I'm looking at the data and the data is telling me exactly what's happening.
And that is very important to have factual information there, and that's how we're using data, whether to make better decision making and create value. So maybe we have a minute. I'm going to ask a quick question. Oh, there's a question over there. We have 1 minute.
Sure, very quick. It's a very insightful conversation. Thank you. One question that pops into my mind is, as we think about data owners across how we would integrate this into an organization, you have the federated model, you have the model where it sits within tech. What works best, and what have you seen that really operationalizes the blend of business side and technology side to make it useful?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I talked a little bit earlier about that. I think the blend is the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle where you have a bit of a hybrid model. You have certain functions that can happen centrally, and it's helpful for them to be centralized around the data governance piece. But then you allow that freedom in a more federated manner, and you bring it closer to the business. And you establish a true partnership between the business people, the technology, chief data office, so the governance piece as well, even though that's centralized, that still needs to be aligned to the business and be applicable. And then, well, in the space in which I operate, there is a big compliance component, and so the risk management has to be brought into play.
Yeah.
But the closest you are to the business and the closest you are to the ultimate users of that data and integrate that data knowledge with their business knowledge, that's where
Thank you.
I've seen most success.
Thank you, Letty. You are lucky. We are a little bit behind, so I hope you got your answer. Thank you so much, Letty, for this really insightful conversation. I had a great time. I hope you had too. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And I need to wrap it up so we can go to our next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.